Hello, welcome back to my channel. My name is Minen and I'm a personal stylist, and today we're talking about vertical lines and why this matters in styling. Before we dive in, I just wanted to mention that I have a new series coming out that I'm really excited about, but I do need your help a little bit. I want to do kind of like focus in on a brand or a clothing store, and I want to walk through with you in a video what pieces would work for certain essences and certain body types, as well as maybe a little bit of coloring, because I find that people ask me a lot where to get certain things for certain body types or essences, and this might be really helpful. And then when you're shopping in those stores or online, it's easy to know which stores to go to. So please drop down below what stores you want me to do this with. I've got a few ideas myself that I'd like to start with, but I also want to see what you guys are interested in seeing. All right, let's dive in. To start off, I just want to mention that these are always going to be very general videos. So my curve one, my body flesh one, and now this one, they have more of a generalized feel to them. Because we're all incredibly unique, you may find that you don't fit 100% in these videos, and that's actually quite normal. Don't stress about it. It's supposed to give you kind of an insight into thinking about how your body is created or how it was shaped, and from there, you start to build that knowledge on why it is the way you look. That's not English. Why you look the way you do. That's better. So vertical, why does it matter? The thing is, once I got into sewing and understanding, clothing and making of clothing, it's really apparent that proportions are kind of everything. And unfortunately, stores are made so that it fits the majority of people, and they don't really consider body type specific. So knowing your exact proportions and how your vertical plays into that is going to be incredibly empowering to know exactly what to look for in stores, what kind of cuts, and especially your hem or where things should end. And this really does differ from body type to body type. I like to kind of categorize it from talls. That's not a technical term, but tall people, moderate, and petites. But there's a bit of variation in each one, not drastic in any way, but just a little bit of more information. And I'm going to go through each body type and how vertical plays a role and what that means when we get dressed. Okay, first, what is vertical? It literally means how much vertical space, or what's your vertical doing as an impression when we first look at you. That's kind of number one part of vertical. The second one is the actual dimensions of your vertical. Not necessarily your exact height, although it does play a role to some degree, but I'm talking about like measurement of bones. Yes, short bones, long bones, all of that plays into it. It's more about, does your stature register as tall, kind of in between, or shorter? And I will note that other things in vertical kind of come into play a little bit, and that's your bone type, so delicate or more strong or bigger bones. And other things like your flesh type can also kind of impact the way your vertical ends up looking like. If you need any help on your curve type or your flesh type, I have videos up here. I'll link them both. So let's start with taller bodies. Dramatics are tall looking, yes, but it's not their main thing. Now, just wait. Their main thing is that they're really sharp looking in their bones, and that they're very, boxy shaped, extremely yang looking. And part of that yang is that tall aspect. It's an elongated look. And that just means that your bones are literally, they look more elongated than they do short and, thicker looking. But you don't have to, height-wise, in terms of metrics, need to be extremely tall to be a dramatic. You have to appear tall. What does that mean, and how does this happen? Because a dramatic's bones are sharp, narrow, and elongated, when you put it all together, the effect of all of those bones in one shape gives the illusion of that elongation that I'm talking about. It gives the illusion of length. And sometimes their bones are even bigger, and more often than not, they are bigger than delicate, because I'll talk about that later. There are things called delicate dramatics, but I'll get into that in another video. Because so much of that sharpness and slightly longer or more narrow bones, the moment that those are all placed together and above any kind of shorter height in metrics, they look and appear elongated. And of course, sometimes they are just tall people, and that's very accurate too when it comes to dramatics. So all the bones are lengthening at once, and so that really gives the illusion that there is length there. However, they are not petite, and by petite, I mean they generally aren't short, under 5'5", because there's so much of that bigger bone present and the sharpness all over, and then the elongation all together gives that impression of that extreme vertical look. So what do I mean by elongated bones? Now this is going to be pertinent for all the body types, so although I'm talking about it in dramatics, just remember this. So when you look at, the sections of your arm, for example, you've got this section, and then maybe your hands, right? Like this one section, this could be a second section, and this would be a third. So oftentimes that's kind of how we're measuring the bone length. And you're also looking at it as a totality and in reference to the rest of your body. So those three things are kind of all what we're looking at when we talk about elongated bones. So if we were to split them into sections, this section would be quite long on a dramatic, or longer than average. So it doesn't have to be extremely long, because that will be flamboyant naturals. However, there is length here, and it's a bit bigger and longer bones. Same with this section here. This will also be long. A good idea when you are trying to figure out your own measurements, your own proportions, is to look at pictures of yourself next to a lot of people. And if predominantly you look like you have longer bones in that area than the average person, then you may have longer bones. It's sometimes difficult to look just solely at your own structure and try to determine, because we are not good at being objective when it comes to our own bodies. So that same sectioning you do for all of your bones. So like your torso height and the length of it, your legs, you can split it up into sections as well. And then that overall impression, do I mostly have elongated limbs? Is it a mixture of all? Are they short? That gives you an idea of that overall vertical impression. And dramatics have a lot more of that elongated, sharp bone look to them, which gives the impression that they are tall, and they generally are. So what does this mean when it comes to clothing? You want to mimic, and this again will be part of every body type I talk about, you want to mimic what your bones are doing, because that looks beautiful. You're honoring the fact that either you're elongated, shorter, or somewhere in between, or a mixture of both. So if you have overall longer bones, and with dramatics you have that presence of bigger bones and sharp looking bones, that is why longer and narrow pieces look really good on them, because we're mimicking their bone, we're mimicking that vertical impression that they give. Also why they can do boxing slightly oversized, because it has that larger structure to it, or that density that can hold on to a larger piece of clothing, like a wider piece or a more oversized piece. Your bones are not delicate, so you don't need delicate pieces. It's that mimicking factor. And there is, of course, some element to the essences that kind of can play into this a little bit, but for right now, we're talking about structure only. Okay, so focus more on just 100% structure. And it doesn't matter if you are a dramatic or a soft dramatic, you both can handle those longer pieces and things that are a little bit more oversized. The only difference is that dramatics, pure dramatics, don't need any waist emphasis or any kind of rounded edges to it at all, or softer materials, whereas soft dramatics do. But they still look good in elongated things because their bone structure is elongated. They have sharper bones underneath the softness. And so they also need things that are quite long and somewhat hold their structure, but in a softer sense. And they can do things that are a little bit grander or more oversized, still keeping in with that waist, because their structure is, that vertical is such a statuesque feel to it, and those bones are large enough to handle it. The other tallies, I don't know what to call them, the other tall grouping, flamboyant naturals. They have an even more extreme elongated look to them, and that typically is why you hear the word flamboyant. It just means, you know, an exaggeration. So they will often have extremely long arms and legs, and that really helps to give that impression of length. Another thing that they have and can have is, again, that presence of bigger bones and width, which coupled with all the elongation and a larger width, you can look quite stately, quite regal. Or like how I used to say in my other videos, you look like a willow tree, because there is such this base that's very strong, very solid, very long. And then you've got the trees or the leaves, whatever you want to call them, the branches, that are more flowy and very elongated. And that's kind of what flamboyant naturals look like, generally. So that V top half, the long arms, the long legs, that all gives the impression of length, of vertical. So that's now going to be the first thing we notice, is there is elongation happening, there is stature, there is vertical, a long vertical. This means, because that's kind of their main focus, their main thing is that they are tall, or they look very tall, as opposed to dramatics. That's not their main thing. The main thing is that they're predominantly yang, and that they have, you know, those very sharp looking bones. Flamboyant naturals have blunt bones. Their bones are an addition to their length, and the length is the thing that we're really, really noticing, that kind of bluntness and length all together in this very elongated look. And because you're removing that element of sharpness, that's when the elongation kind of becomes the main focus. Some fall actually outside of this category, because there are things such as short flamboyant naturals, but they take all the elements of, you know, that elongation. So they have quite long bones again that we were talking about in those sections, and they're a bit bigger and blunt, and that's kind of the first thing we notice, is all this length, this elongation. But they don't have delicate bones, and so they may be shorter in measurement, but they don't have that delicate presence, so they aren't petite. That can be like someone like Sarah Jessica Parker. She actually does look good in like long flowy things because of her long limbs, and they are not delicate looking. So her thing is still mainly elongation. We still get that impression that there is elongation going on, that flamboyant element to it. She's just not tall, and that does happen, so it's not impossible. But again, their main thing is that there's this elongation, whereas the main thing in a dramatic is sharpness. And this is why, you know, flamboyant naturals look so good in unconstructed, slightly kind of flowier pieces, because their whole thing is vertical. Their whole thing is the stature and this elongation. And so things can kind of sit on it without getting lost, right? It becomes, I've said this before in other videos, their bodies act like those hangers or racks, or there's a reason models typically are this body type, is because things can sit on it and it can handle the amount of fabric that you have. Moderate limbs or moderate vertical. So naturals, pure naturals, can kind of sit a little bit in the more vertical look and a bit more in a moderate sense. So right now I'm going to talk about it more in a moderate sense, where they're fairly overall very well proportioned. They just have lots of bluntness in their bones, which makes them naturals and width, as well as classics, who typically are moderate, and that's the point of them, with a little bit of softness or a little bit of dramatic, but overall they are moderate. And soft naturals tend to be moderate heights. So I'm gonna include them in the moderate. It just means that overall things are not in any extreme with them. They are more in the middle ground in terms of proportions and that vertical line especially. This group was made for midi lengths. Why? Because your body is midi. Your body is well proportioned. That just means there's no extremity to any of the bones and that vertical impression that you give. So if you were gonna measure out, things are fairly equal, not super long, not super short, and your leg length, your arm length, your torso length tend to be in well balanced, combinations. There can be some variation, especially in the naturals because they aren't classics, but classics tend to be quite proportioned in terms of those elements. And so with any of your hems or your lengths, you want to mimic that moderation as much as possible. So you're not going to be doing cropped or super long, because immediately when you do not have that vertical impression to hold it in a good place that feels natural on you. Should use the word natural because we're talking about natural body types, but it doesn't look like it was made for you. You may start to veer into your swimming in it. With naturals specifically, because they have width present, it's going to change their vertical impression. That means that when you add on moderate sized bones, moderate length in your arms and legs and torso, in some fashion, usually in fairly proportioned areas, then you add in width, your vertical becomes less elongated and becomes a bit more overall medium, because you're kind of mimicking the amount of width here as there is in the length here. So you're not quite, a box, but it can explain why some naturals and soft naturals might look a little bit shorter than they are, because if they have an extreme width to them with those moderate length vertical pieces, they may overall look a little bit shrunken because that width brought it down. It brought down that elongated look. That vertical look comes back to more of a moderate and sometimes a slightly shorter. But they aren't petite because they've got that bigger or more moderate sized bones, I should say, and they don't have delicateness present. They don't have, in other words, they don't have that narrowness and that extreme elongation to give the impression of height. So they sit more moderately overall. So keep those proportions moderate for them. I love moderation on naturals and soft naturals. So that means, don't have to do super high-waisted for naturals. They can, of course, depending on their specific proportions. But if you are fairly evened, I find that not wearing super high-waisted looks really good on a very moderate sized natural. And it also helps to just honor that moderation. And that means you can do things that are a little bit slightly wider, like a bell sleeve, but not extremely so. So even that becomes a bit more in that moderate way. Then you bring in soft naturals who are a bit smaller than a natural. And in that way, that's why we gotta bring it in, not just because they have softness, but they are a little bit more compact, a little smaller. So you don't wanna do things so oversized or so flowy unconstructed. You need to construct it a little bit, bring it in a tiny bit, because they can get overwhelmed if it's too flowy or too much on them, because that vertical just cannot handle it. Soft naturals can do high-waisted because they're soft, and that does look really good, and you want to find that where you come in the most with pants and skirts. But I still believe the length and things need to be moderate. You don't want to do cropped because why? Why? Cropped on someone that has width and is moderate will give the illusion that you've shrunken down. It starts to just put you boxy, and you're not quite boxy, you're blunt with more V shapes, more width, and you need that to breathe. So I find that cropped things kind of limits what moderation you do have in your length. So midi for you is beautiful, naturals and soft naturals. Depending on the height of a natural you are, you could go a little longer, but generally speaking, you want it to be pretty midi. And if you're kind of a shorter, but not delicate or petite, soft natural, you want to maybe go more to the knee, nothing lower, because then that can drag you down. So you will know immediately if you look like a little child. Or if you look wider than you are, it's because you took out the balance of that vertical line, essentially. You brought it down too much and there's not enough of that vertical in your body structure to honor and to balance that out. And so then the width becomes the show. And that's when you look wider and like stumpy almost. Classics and dramatic classics especially, you can be a little bit taller. So that is possible. And if that were the case, and if you do have more of an elongated look to you, but you're still very moderate, two things. You can do a little longer, but not oversized. Because you're still very moderate and not extremely sharp or extremely elongated looking, you're still going to be on the moderate side of things. So you don't want to do anything extreme. You want to mimic still your moderation, and that can play around with the length of that, but generally midi looks really nice. You can do a little longer if you're on the longer or taller vertical side of things. But again, no cropped, because that's gonna kind of mess with your moderation. High-waisted looks good on you too, because you do have that length, but not too extreme, because again, your bodies, dramatic classics and soft classics, don't have extremities. They are quite balanced overall. And that is in reference to their vertical, right? You're not gonna feel like, wow, she's really tall. Wow, she's short. It's going to be very, very balanced. Now, soft classics, they actually can be quite delicate at times. The difference is though that they don't have short bones. So they aren't petite. They've got more of that delicate look to them, and they can almost veer into a petite zone easily, but they definitely sit more in a moderate world. And because they don't have those shorter bones, they are going to still appear quite balanced vertically. And they won't appear super tall or short. They might just be kind of in this really in between, maybe shorter, but that's only from the presence of delicate bones. So you kind of need to figure out what kind of soft classic you are, but generally speaking, a very standard soft classic is gonna still look good in moderation. So moderate length, and then the more you go into a delicate soft classic, they'll actually look good with shorter hemlines, so shorter dresses and skirts, and they can pull it off because they have that delicateness present, and they may not be as moderate. They can be slightly under like 5'5". Petites. Now, there are two different kind of categories of petites, so I'll talk about them in chunks. The first is the gamines, and then it's going to be the romantics. So what is petite? It has two, generally speaking, it has to have two things present: your delicate bones and shorter bones. Shorter in reference to a moderate frame. That's the best way I can describe it, because flamboyant gamines can look elongated, but they're in a smaller frame. I think I talked about this in my flamboyant gamine video, but it's like you took a moderate person, took the corners of a picture and shrunk them. So looking at a flamboyant gamine on their own, they're going to appear elongated. They're going to appear tall. Why? Same reason as dramatics or flamboyant naturals. Their bones do have that elongated look to them, and they're sharper and narrow. And like I said before, those things combined can give the illusion of vertical. However, flamboyant gamines are not actually tall in reference to moderate or taller people. And that goes back to the sections I was talking about. So together, all three of my sections, they look long on me. Why? Because a flamboyant gamine has a mixture of short and long sometimes. And I have a shorter torso, so my arms look quite long and each piece can be long for my size. For someone that is my normal height, should have shorter bones, technically. They shouldn't, I mean, we're all made exactly as we should, but that gives the illusion that I'm taller than I actually am. Longer looking is the key word. It looks long and elongated, but because the combination of that with delicate bones means petite, then it really comes into that corner shrinking, and then everything becomes smaller, daintier, petite with some elongation, but only in your small frame does it look elongated. And then you've got soft gamines who have some of those elements too, with soft flesh sitting on top, or they will have very short bones, and so they do look quite petite as a result. But the reason we're gamine is because there's, you know, a little bit of yang, a little bit of yin kind of mixed in, and then in these small compact frames. So both flamboyant gamine and soft gamine thrive in petite and cropped things because that's how our bodies are made. And especially when you mimic your shorter torso, for example, and then crop your pants or your skirts to kind of balance out these long elongated pieces and these shorter pieces. And then it looks, the impression becomes that you look balanced and moderate. You're honoring these shorter bones by finding things that fit those short bones, and then you look moderate. So this, I wore this sweater for this example. This on someone else will come to here. That's how, you know, the length is going to be on someone else. But because I have shorter bones in reference to a moderate frame, and in my frame they're shorter and delicate, it comes to here, which is ideal for a gamine because now I look like, or the impression is that there is balance and moderation happening in a small petite frame. The moment you disregard that and wear things that are made for moderate or taller, that's when people feel like they're a kid wearing adult clothing and they're swimming in it. And they can get lost so easily because of the presence of those two things, the delicate bones and the shorter bones. You're essentially cropping everything because that is sort of what your body type is doing, or your vertical is cropped. But flamboyant gamines have elongated, cropped, and soft gamines tend to not as much. But both are cropped bones. Let's put it that way, cropped bones. Now there are some soft gamines that are actually quite moderate looking and short all over. And in that instance, when you're that kind, that's when you can do a little bit of a midi length. Not too midi, just below the knee is a good length for you. And that's because you're now just like a shrunken version of a moderate. And so if you find your proportion, which is just below the knee, that looks like what a moderate person looks like in a midi length, if that makes any sense. You're still honoring your well-proportioned body type. And because all the bones are short, you actually don't look as, you don't need that croppedness because it's, again, kind of taking a moderate body and just shrinking the bones. Still moderate, just in a smaller package. Lastly, the last petites, which are theatrical romantics and romantics. Now, they tend to actually be quite proportioned, sort of what I was just talking about with the soft gamines. They're well proportioned, and so you, again, don't need cropped elements as much. You just want to find where your proportions are. So some, if they're short all over, are just going to need to find cropped things, but they'll look moderate on them. And it's really just the fact that you're honoring shorter bones, but you're not cropping things necessarily. So things ending at the top of your bone, your hip bones, or a little bit in the middle actually looks quite proportional on a shorter boned but petite. And again, you still have those two things present Petite have short bones and delicate bones, and so that's where that falls into. Romantics, however, can be kind of moderate height. They don't have to be short, and they don't have to have short bones, but they do have an overwhelming amount of delicate bones. And there's so much soft flesh, which is what really puts them into that category. And they don't have that elongated bone structure the way soft dramatics do. And so they can kind of mimic that same moderation rules that, say, a soft classic has or a soft natural has. They can't do anything too extreme or they will swallow them up, but they can and do look beautiful in moderate lines. So midi cuts, they can do up to the knee. That also looks really beautiful. Nothing overly cropped in the body, because then they've thrown off their proportions. And their main thing is really not vertical. It's the opposite of flamboyant naturals and dramatics. Their whole thing is flesh. And so playing up vertical in that sense is just not going to honor that type of body type as much. In fact, proportioned and moderate is kind of key with that, because you do not want vertical to become center stage when it's really not the thing that makes them beautiful. Okay, so that's just a little taste of the vertical lines. I will get into much more specific, detailed videos in the future. For now, I'm kind of introducing those key topics: curve, flesh type, vertical. Let me know down below if there's any other kind of terms that are confusing or that you need clarity on. But I will be going into depth on all of those little topics more and more and more until you get it and you will never question it again. That's the goal. Let me know down below what kind of vertical you have, if you've got that elongated, tall vertical, if you're a more moderate vertical, if you're petite vertical. I want to know all about it down below. I love knowing what's out there. If this was helpful, great, give it a thumbs up, subscribe for more, and I hope you all have a beautiful vertical, whatever kind of vertical day.